So this is a broad overview of the session. So we'll be moving on shortly to the presentation by Martin Mills and Antonina Tereshchenko. Then we'll be hearing some responses from our members of the panel, and I will introduce them later. Then there'll be time for questions from you, the audience, and then we'll be drawing everything to a conclusion at the end. I'm going to start by introducing our two speakers who are going to present their research to us this evening. So firstly, we have Professor Martin Mills, who's the inaugural director of the Centre for Teachers and Teaching Research at UCL Institute of Education. And his particular passions, the areas that he researches are social justice, pedagogy, school reform, teachers' work, teacher education, alternative education and gender. And in England, he's come to us from Australia, but in England, he's been advising the government on alternative provision and teacher education. Along with Martin, we have Dr. Antonina Tereshchenko. She's a research fellow in the Centre for Teachers and Teaching Research at UCL, and she's working on teacher retention research projects. She's also been involved in the brilliant research project called the Best Practice in Grouping Students project, which is about the impact of setting.
I can't hear a thing you're saying.
Grouping. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to hand over to Martin and Antonina, who are going to carry on with their presentation for us.
I think I'm unmuted now, is that correct? Yeah. So thanks for that introduction, Sarah. We're really pleased to be doing this presentation today. I should say that it's the first time we've presented from this research project, and the research project is ongoing. And so these are some of our tentative findings. Antonina has been leading the project and she will present our findings. My role is to say a little bit, to introduce the project, to provide a bit of background to the study. I do want to, as Sarah did, acknowledge that this is a very difficult time for Black and minority ethnic communities in relation to Black Lives Matters, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and minority ethnic communities. And I think also a difficult time for teachers from those communities as we go back into schools and how we engage with this current moment. For us, and Sarah mentioned my background has been a lot of work in social justice issues in education. For us, social justice is absolutely crucial to this project. I think some of you may have seen, there's a great article in The Guardian today by Lola Okolosi about 3 ways for schools to improve race relations now. And one of those was to recruit and retain Black and minority ethnic teachers. For us, that is a crucial social justice issue. I want to say, so I'm just going to give a bit of background around social, my slides aren't moving. A little bit about social justice. And I know for many people, this is kind of quite basic, but I think it's important to set up this framing at the beginning. And I really like the work of Nancy Fraser, who talks about social justice requiring social arrangements that permit all to participate in peers as social life. So overcoming injustice means dismantling institutionalized obstacles that prevent some people from participating on a par with others as full partners in social interaction. So those institutionalized obstacles that both prevent people from Black and minority ethnic communities becoming teachers, and also those obstacles that prevent them progressing and promotion through the system are key obstacles that we have to think about how we tackle and address those. for Fraser, she talks about three kinds of injustice that are interlinked, but are significant. She talks about economic injustice, so issues around poverty, and for her, there is the remedy for that is a redistribution of income. So looking at where do we need to put the money to address, and Gloria Ludston-Billings' work on educational debt is really important. I think, how do we address the debt through extra funding and extra sources of income? I was thinking just before we did this presentation, we've got a project looking at shortage of physics teachers, and a lot of suggestions that have been made about how to get more physics teachers, like paying them more, hasn't exactly been raised in relation to how do we try and attract and retain more Black and minority ethnic teachers. So a lot of the policy and the language around this from government, I think, has been at the symbolic level rather than at the material level. And we have to have some material financial resources put into this issue. Fraser also talks about cultural injustice, issues around recognition, and I'm assuming we all understand many of these issues, how they play out within the curriculum, within various discourses in schools and so on. Sorry, I don't know what to pop in this one. Then she talks about political injustice, and the remedy for that being representation. How do we get a voice, and how do we ensure that all those communities who've been marginalised within schools, how do we ensure their voices are heard? So in addressing these injustices within the school context and within the context of Black and minority ethnic teachers, we have to think through all those injustices, I think, and also think about issues around intersectionality. We know that those obstacles exist when, as soon as you look at what the data are around Black and minority ethnic teachers. And again, some of this will be not unfamiliar to you, that whilst 85.9% of teachers are white British, that compares to 78.5% of the working age population being white British in England. So a disproportionate number of white British teachers. That in terms of minority ethnic groups, all except the Irish, that the percentage of teachers in all those other ethnic groups is lower than in the respective working age populations. And then when you look at head teachers, the disproportionate number of head teachers that are white British. So clearly obstacles in the way of promotion. There has been an increase in the number of teachers. So some of these data come from the DFE and the teacher workforce census data. There has been some increase in the number of proportion of teachers from minority ethnic groups, but and I'll come back to that, it's insignificant, but it's not just a case, I don't think, and we don't think, of attracting more teachers to the profession. It's also retaining those teachers once we have them in the profession. And so an aspect of social justice that we've been drawn to is Paul Gomberg's notion of contributive justice, where what he talks about is your experience of work is a social justice issue. And that part of that is in the workplace, we have to challenge things like meritocracy. And so, because the notion of meritocracy is not accurate, it doesn't hold true when you look at who does get promoted, who doesn't get promoted. And I think about that in my own institution. Andrew Sayer, who's worked with Paul Gomberg's work quite a bit, makes the point that what we do in life has at least as much influence on who we become and the quality of our lives as does what we get. So whilst we have to do, income is important, resources are important, but for many teachers, their experience of the workplace is absolutely crucial, right? And so what Andrew Sayer talks about is this notion of justice concerns what people are allowed, expected, or required to do or contribute. So if you are, and Kathleen Lynch picks up on this, if you are always given the difficult, the boring, the dirty, or the tiring work, then it becomes hugely problematic. And some of this can be based on essentialist discourses. So I think of some of the black minority ethnic teachers I've talked to, especially when I've done work around male teachers, talk about being given the naughty kids and how these male teachers are expected to address and be able to deal with the naughty kids. Not a minority ethnic teacher, but a male teacher that I interviewed in Australia and have written a paper about. He talked about how he went into a primary school and the primary school was really thrilled to have him. He was this kind of wonderful, we're getting a male teacher in primary school. He said he was given all the naughty kids. He said there were many female teachers in the school who could handle those kids much better than he was. He was constantly given the cricket and the rugby. He said he hated sport, so they didn't like sport. And then he ended up leaving at the end of a year. And I suppose the point of that story is we make essentialist assumptions about people when they come into the workplace, and that we have to have conversations with those people in order to retain them, to ensure that they are eased into the workplace, that they are not, that their contributions are valued both by themselves and by others. So before I hand over to Antonina to actually show some of the findings, is that as we've put this project together, there are issues that we've had to think through. And I think there are key issues that relate to the schooling system itself, about how we tackle white privilege. Just before I came onto this presentation, I was looking through The Guardian, and there was a name of one of the people at Reading the name was familiar to me, who was murdered in the park at Reading. And for some reason, I was just trying to see if I could find out a little bit more about it. And I followed the Twitter handle and the Twitter thing on the story. And it came up about the police in the story. And there was a black police officer who made the point that he was often told he had to make a decision as to whether he was blue or black. And I remember interviewing an Indigenous teacher in Western Queensland, and he made a similar point where someone from the community said to him, you need to decide whether you're Aboriginal or you're a teacher, as if you couldn't be both. And it seems to me, if you're thinking of the police force in those ways, or the schools in those ways, that there is something fundamental about the school that needs to be changed and challenged to ensure that they aren't seen as white institutions. We've also had to think about, what does the community mean? And I think that the word community is often thrown up, and it's a feel-good term. Zygmunt Bauman talks about it as a dangerous concept, because you can only have a community if there are people not part of that community. So it has to be exclusive as well as inclusive. And so who gets to be part of the community? And that communities are never homogenous either. There is communities within communities. And so the term community is one that we have to think through as we talk about support for people. The other question that's come up is, where should people teach? And I'm sorry to keep relating this back to Australian context, but I remember interviewing an Aboriginal principal who was head of an Aboriginal school. And he said, look, this is great that, that I'm a principal of this school, but we'll know that we've gone a long way when I'm principal. And he named one of the kind of elite government schools in Brisbane, once I'm principal of that school. So where should we be looking for to appoint people? And I think there's issues around that maybe could be part of the discussion. I think there's also problematic notions of tokenism. We need to appoint black and minority ethnic teachers. We'll put one on here and we'll put one there without actually going beyond tokenism. And I think and that involves, and this was part of the story that Lola Okolosi had in The Guardian, it's about listening. It's not just appointing, it's listening to people. But also not getting people to do, I guess, a double shift, in the sense they do all their regular teaching, but they've got to do all the the race equality work in the school. They've got to put all the effort into ensuring that, as the Runnymede Trust had in their report recently, race and racism in secondary schools, the need for not just the need to appoint more black and minority ethnic teachers, but to enhance the racial literacy of all teachers. And so who does that work? Who does improving the racial literacy of all teachers? So I think they're things that we have to think through as we move through our project. Sorry, Antonina, I think I went a bit long. Over to you. Antonina?
Yeah, I'm trying to share the slides.
Yep, they're there.
Excellent. So, as Martin said, I'm going to present empirical work in progress. This project was funded by the British Academy, and we had two key broad objectives here. Firstly, to map the state of minority teaching workforce, to highlight general employment patterns within this group of teachers, and secondly, to explore reasons behind lower rates of minority teacher retention from the perspective of those teachers, using interviews as a medium. And as I said, this is work in progress, and we'd like to hear your comments and questions, so that will be very helpful for us. So to put this in a wider research context, existing literature makes a very good case for the benefits of diverse teaching workforce. Some evidence suggests that exposure to teachers from a similar background has a potential to help students from minority groups attain greater educational success. For example, evidence from the US, where it's possible to link teachers to pupils they teach, show that a disadvantaged Black male's student exposure to at least one Black teacher in primary school reduces his probability of dropping out of school by 40%. So another line of argument focuses on the importance of teachers holding high expectations for students and the role that teacher diversity can play in actually ensuring that these high expectations are expressed of all students. Research has also emphasized that teachers who have some knowledge of children's out-of-school lives and cultures are much less likely to confuse cultural difference for intellectual disadvantage. But, and I'd like to stress this, it's important to be mindful of simplistic matching of teachers to students by racialized backgrounds. We in this project subscribe to the view that all students benefit from diversity of experiences and understandings and from social justice teaching. So, improving retention of teachers from minority ethnic groups is also important for addressing overall national teacher shortages, high rates of teacher turnover and wastage when teachers leave the state sector completely. And available analysis of data sets in England show that disadvantaged schools hire more minority and young teachers, but also experience higher turnover rates among these groups. International research, mainly from the US, where the majority of work has been done in this area, show that minority teachers tend to work in schools serving high minority, high poverty, urban communities. We also know from DFE analysis that BAME NQTs have high retention rates in inner and outer London, but lower retention rates across the rest of the country. And early retention, career retention is significantly lower for minority teachers across all available training routes in England. So, the first part of our research analyzes the employment patterns of minority teachers in England in this context that I've just presented. And specifically, we are exploring what types of schools teachers from non-white British ethnicity are more likely to work in. Do they tend to work like in the US in urban schools, disadvantaged schools, diverse schools, or not? So before going into data model, actually, I just want to mention the data we used for this analysis. So to do this analysis of employment patterns, we used 2018 school workforce census, which has data on the proportion of non-white British teachers and also teaching assistants, non-teaching support staff, and so on. We linked that data with general school census, which gives us proxies for the diversity of the school intake. So, for example, EL pupil, percentage of EL pupils, proxies for disadvantage, such as FSM. We also had data on Ofsted grades within the schools. And just to mention that over 21,000 schools across England were included in this analysis. But before going into data modeling, I just wanted to show you a couple of descriptive slides. So this focus, in this slide, the focus is on schools rather than comparing types of teachers within schools. So this table shows that how many schools in England have staff from minority ethnic groups by 4 key functions within the school. So if you look at the first and second line, you can see that just over half of schools employ teachers or teaching assistants from minority ethnic groups. This table presents a slightly different view, focusing on the breadth of functions within the school. So the top red line shows that over 25% of schools in England, or 1 in 4 schools, do not employ any staff from minority groups at all. And if you look down, you can see that the bottom highlighted line says that 17% of schools in England have minority ethnic staff in all functions, including teachers and teaching assistants, support, and other auxiliary staff. So this is just for the background. But going into data modeling and actually trying to establish where minority ethnic teachers work, I will first present the overall picture from England, taking all schools in England into account. So there is a lot to take in, I know, so I'm going to spend some time on this. So on this graph, blue bars here represent the proportion of schools in specific regions across England. And the names of regions are written at the bottom here. The red line shows the average proportion of teachers from minority groups in all schools in that region. So you can see that the red line peaks over inner London here and over outer London. So London has by far the greatest concentration of minority ethnic teachers in England. So now we are moving from school location to school characteristics on this slide. Again, blue bars represent schools with different proportion of EL pupils. So looking at this graph, as you move from left to right, you are increasing the percentage of EL pupils in schools. And as before, the red line traces the proportion of minority teachers in schools, showing in this case that the concentration of minority teachers in schools increases along with the percentage of EL pupils. The next set of very influential characteristics reflect the ethnic composition of other job functions within the school, where the minority teachers work. So in this graph, as before, the red line traces the proportion of minority teachers, And down the bottom, we can see the proportion of teaching assistants within the school who come from minority ethnic groups. So in schools with over 30% of teaching assistants from minority ethnic groups, there are 35% of teachers from minority groups. And the same trend is true for all other functions within the school. As the proportion of staff from minority ethnic group increases, so does the proportion of teachers from minority ethnic group. So it does seem that diversity is a key predictor. So to minimize the number of graphs showing, I'm just going to summarize that also minority ethnic teachers are more likely to be found among secondary schools, as the concentration of male teachers in school increases, which I think points to secondary schools context, among schools with the greater number of unqualified teachers, and among schools with the higher mean gross salaries for teachers. I think the last two school characteristics also point to the location of schools in London. So to address this issue of a very strong London effect, we disaggregated analysis between London and elsewhere in England. And again, looking at characteristics of interest, here on this graph, blue bars represent London schools and gray bars represent schools outside London. And as we move from left to right, we're increasing the percentage of EL pupils in schools. The orange top line traces the proportion of minority teachers in London, and the bottom yellow line traces the proportion of minority teachers outside of London. We see that there are more teachers from minority groups in schools with higher number of EL students, both in London and outside of London. Now we are looking at bars which represent the schools with different percentage of pupils on free school meals. So our proxy for disadvantaged schools, or one of our proxies. Within London, there is a relationship between the prevalence of minority ethnic teachers and the concentration of pupils on free school meals. So this is this orange line. Outside of London, this association is actually not so pronounced. So another available school characteristic which relates to disadvantage is the location of the school in different quantiles of the income deprivation affecting children index, which basically measures the proportion of all children up to the age 15 living in income-deprived families. And on this graph, if 5 here on the right, value 5 represents the most deprived school location, then we can see as child deprivation increases, so does the likelihood of schools employing minority ethnic teachers. So this is the London orange line, and this is the outside of London yellow line, which traces the proportion of minority ethnic teachers. So this is much more pronounced in London. So 40% of schools have the most deprived classification in London, shown by this bar on the right. And within these schools, around 45% of staff are from non-white backgrounds. We have also tried a slightly different analysis to identify school characteristics predicting the percentage of minority teachers in a school, and again compare this between London and elsewhere. And because it's a slightly different analysis, it could have produced a different picture, but luckily it didn't. So consider the national picture first. So there are 8 significant predictors which predict schools employing minority ethnic teachers in England. So school ethnic, and these are just shown here from 1 to 8 in order of priority or magnitude. So school ethnic diversity in terms of staff, so presence of teaching assistant, non-classroom based school support staff and auxiliary staff from minority ethnic groups are quite important, as well as location of school in London and the presence of EL children. If we look at London now, rather than England as a whole, we too see that more minority ethnic teachers are found in schools with ethnically diverse staff and students. We also see that effectiveness of school leadership and management becomes marginally influential, and also the location of school are in most deprived areas, number 7. So generally, although we didn't observe much relationship between Ofsted grade and presence of teachers, here we see that minority teachers are found in schools with less effective leadership and management, according to Ofsted, which might explain some findings in the literature saying that minority teachers often leave disadvantaged schools, but they are not necessarily fleeing disadvantaged children, that it has to do often with the quality of leadership and management of the school. And outside of London predictors, we're seeing the same type of key characteristics defining the school with a large proportion of non-white British teachers, so the presence of other minority staff and EL pupils. So I just want to make a few points linking all that to the national teacher retention picture in England. And I would be interested to hear your reflections at the end as well. So we know that London has the lowest retention nationally. We also know the intake of London schools are often more ethnically diverse and disadvantaged. And we know that the high teacher turnover has a negative impact on the outcomes of disadvantaged students. And we know that as a teacher leaves a school in London, she's going to be replaced by an even less experienced teacher who would also leave within a year or 2. Importantly, I think here for our discussion is the fact that in a survey for the Teach London program, they found that BAME teachers said they were more likely than white British teachers to remain teaching in London, of course, if certain conditions were met. There is also research evidence that teachers who do stay teaching in challenging schools in England come from similar background to children. And it does look in our analysis that teachers from minority ethnic groups are more likely to teach in diverse schools. So now I'm just going to move into interview data to try to explain why do teachers actually choose to work in diverse schools, and how does this happen? Because that kind of statistical data analysis doesn't tell us anything about it. So here, consider the first interview quote from a secondary social science teacher who said in the interview, "I'm probably going to move out of London, but I want to work in London because of the demographics. So yeah, it's important." The other teacher is reflecting that when choosing a school, it does matter what their culture is and how they view ethnic minorities. And he says, if you walk around on the interview and don't see that reflected in students or staff, then I probably will be less likely to go and work there. Another teacher is reflecting on her experience in a school where she actually enjoyed her time. She says the SLT was saying, we want our teachers to be reflective of our students. The deputy head was, I think, Indian. The head teacher, I think, was from Eastern Europe. So it was very mixed. Actually, I did enjoy my time at that school. This is an interesting one, an interview from a very experienced teacher who was in a senior leadership role at the time of the interview. And she talked about how she didn't think about diversity of schools at the beginning of her career. But then when she moved to a diverse school in terms of student intake, she learned, okay, this is important. It's important that you are a Black person in a school, because I could feel the change as soon as I walked into the school. Oh, you are Black and you are a leader. So far, we've had 22 interviews with secondary and primary school teachers from different ethnic backgrounds. And what's interesting when we looked at key retention factors for those teachers is that there was a clear difference between teachers who taught for 5 or less years and experienced teachers who had been in profession for well over 5 years. And when we asked them about what would be their key retention factor, younger teachers talked about possibility to develop as a teacher, getting CPD. They valued being able to have autonomy and the ability to bring unique perspective to the classroom. Multicultural capital was valued, as the previous slide shown. But what was striking is that experienced teachers talked mainly about career progression. And that's because I think is that the longer they taught, the clearer it became for them that it's extremely difficult to get a promotion. So these are just some of the quotes from teachers, experienced teachers. So I thought I will also reflect through the eyes of experienced teachers on that question, does hard work pay off? And show you a few quotes on this topic. So this is a quote from a teacher who grew up in an immigrant household, and he reflects that if I knew what I needed to do to get the promotion, then obviously I would do that. But obviously growing up, I was just told hard work pays off. But now I'm realizing that's not the case. This teacher, in response to my question, what kept her in her school for 10 years, told me that it was just that sort of dangled carrot of promotion in front of me for such a long time. And being sent on sort of faulty courses, and then realizing, seeing colleagues that are much less experienced being sent on much more recognizable courses. The other teacher says, so a fool like me, who says, okay, I'm dedicated to teaching, I've been teaching 20 years, I can't make it, but someone who's been teaching for 2 years is now telling me how to teach. And I think she refers to the rapid promotion of teach first teachers. And here's another teacher reflecting on the case, on the fact that SLTs are quite a tight-knit group of people, and they're all friends. So she's saying, I don't know if there would ever be someone new coming into the middle leadership. And she's thinking, okay, so do I stay or do I go here? And the other thing I wanted to highlight, because that surprised me in all of the 22 interviews I conducted with teachers, that none of them talked about workload as the main retention factor. Whereas we know that workload always comes up as the top priority for teachers nationally when they talk about why they might have left teaching profession. So there are, again, a few quotes which I think are quite telling. So what this teacher says, when you are an ethnic minority, you know that workload is part and parcel of your life. So the work wasn't really the issue for me. It was really the toxicity that was geared towards me. I could do the work. This teacher, who was in the process of leaving the profession altogether, said, my leaving teaching has nothing to do with workload. It was everything to do with me being a person of color and the issues that mattered to me. And the voice that I wanted to have as a leader made people uncomfortable. So they do recognize that workload is an issue, but there is also a feeling of being valued by SLT, and it's not there. This younger teacher says that she left the first school because of leadership workload, but she says most importantly, it's because of the way they treated sociology, like the way they treated sixth form in general, to be honest, because there was no respect for sixth form. So respect here is a key word, I think. And I just want to say a few more things as implication for further research, because obviously the analysis we've done has limitations as any research. So we presented presented a static picture. So this is 2018, that's where teachers work. But I think the next step would be to actually investigate trajectories of individual teachers to determine drivers for minority teachers leaving the profession and moving within the sector, possibly over 10 years or so. There is a lot of research, including our research, which is highlighting issues with the retention and experiences of minority ethnic teachers. So I think it would be important to identify schools with successful retention and actually document these practices in the form of case study. What also comes out is through interviews that we're in the process of doing is those intersectional identities and hierarchies in teaching trajectories and experiences. And these relate to specific ethnic subgroups because obviously we know that histories of inequalities vary. It seemed that the immigrant background of teachers intersected in such a way that made them particularly marginalized within the English school system. And also subjects which teachers taught are very important. So it does matter whether you are a male science teacher or if you're a female sociology teacher. So I think I'll finish there and we'll be very happy to take any questions or comments from you.
Thank you, Martin and Antonina. Just a couple of clarification questions that came up during that presentation, Antonina. First of all, is it, Manny has asked, is it correct that your graph was showing that schools in the most deprived areas have 40% of their staff from non-white backgrounds? Is that the correct interpretation of the graph?
Yeah, that was the correct interpretation for London only. So the relationship is much less pronounced outside of London, but there is still a significant relationship there.
And then there was another question about whether you did any research into unconscious bias as part of the recruitment process. I'm pretty sure that your research did not cover that. Is that correct?
No, we haven't covered this in this research. However, at the end of each interview, we asked teachers to reflect on what could be done, and those things came up very frequently. So we hope in our report, which we hope to publish in autumn, we'll come back together with our participants to actually come up with recommendations. And I sense that this will be one of those recommendations.
Okay, and I certainly know that our panel are kind of chomping at the bit to get their teeth into the idea of unconscious bias. That might be something that the panel might raise afterwards. Oh, there's one final question coming in. Do you have any data on the percentage of Black and minority ethnic teachers in senior leadership roles?
So as Martin said at the beginning, so national figures show that something like 95.9% of teachers, head teachers or senior leaders come from white British background. In this research, we focus specifically on classroom teachers, although we had 1 or 2 teachers who were in senior leadership teams as well, but not head teachers.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on now to the next part of our presentation. Kate, I don't know if you want to, actually no, we'll leave the speakers up. I'm just going to introduce you to our panel, who are all head teachers from minority ethnic backgrounds. They're going to each give a 2-minute response to Martin and Antonina's presentation, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. So now is the time to post your name, your school and your role into the chat function, along with any questions that you might ask the panel to answer, or that you might want Antonina or Martin to answer. So I'm going to start by introducing you to the panel. We have on the panel this evening Nahida Maharasingham, who is head teacher at Rathfern Primary School, which is a chartered college hub school, which is dedicated to promoting research and evidence in education. She's particularly passionate about social justice, and her approach to that at Rathfern has been to have a metacognitive curriculum and pedagogies embedded across the school. We then have Rima Reid, who's been teaching for over 20 years and been a head for around 12 years at Hollydale Primary in South London. She's also been the head teacher of a Muslim faith school. She has a school which is very engaged in music, and she's passionate about Black and minority ethnic opportunities in education and opportunities for all. We have Susan Service, who's head teacher of the Arts and Media School in Islington. She's been there for 4 years and teaching for 26 years, and she's particularly passionate about teacher professional development. Then we have Martha Braithwaite, who's head teacher at St Mark's Primary School. She's been head there for 8 years and teaching for 24 years in Islington schools. And her focus is on celebrating the school community and getting the best from them. And then finally, we have Dr. Kulvan Atwal, who's head teacher in Highlands Primary in Redbridge and executive head teacher now over another school as well. His expertise and interest is in teacher professional learning and particularly research approaches to professional development. And you might want to check out his book on Amazon, which is called The Thinking School. So I'm going to start by asking each of those people to give us a 2-minute response. And first on the list, I have Nahida. Nahida, have we got you there?
I needed to unmute myself. Okay. So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation and the great chat. Comments are brilliant. So I am a head teacher of a school, wonderful school in Catford. I am from a Pakistani working class background. My school has a population of over 80% BME pupils, and my middle and senior leadership team is also over 80% BME, and that's a very important part of our success. My belief very strongly is that teachers and leaders need to have the expectations that can fundamentally disrupt entrenched inequalities for BME and poor BME working class students. And I have an issue with research evidence because I think that there are serious limitations to it. They very rarely access a racial justice lens. So I look at research through a social justice lens to transform outcomes. There are huge challenges because systemic racism is profound, and systemic racism is deeply rooted and remains largely uninterrogated in a systematic and meaningful way. This concerns me greatly because the only time the other issue for me is the intersectionality, so race and class. And it seems that the research gurus that inform schools generally only talk about class when they talk about white children, even though we know that children from Bangladeshi and Pakistani backgrounds are the most likely actually to live in poverty. So the challenge for all of us, and this one I've been engaging with for a long time, is to create safe educational spaces by continuing to understand how whiteness dominates and diminishes those of us who are of colour, and to acknowledge and to promote the acknowledgement and ownership of whiteness as a practice of power, to keep asking questions as leaders and teachers which disrupt unthinking assumptions about children and families based on race and class. And that's kind of what I've got to say.
Thank you, Nahida. That's great. Thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Kulvan to give us his 2 minutes.
Okay. I had a few thoughts prepared, but having looked through the chat, I'm completely going to change what I'm going to say, because clearly there are issues out there in terms of representation at a leadership level. I think we all know that having more teachers of a minority background is going to have a positive impact on our children, and that has come through clearly from the research that was discussed. But our BAME teachers need BAME leaders to look up to. And in terms of representation, they need greater opportunities to be enabled to work across settings, not just in London, but to be able to have opportunities, enriched leadership opportunities, to even out an uneven playing field. And I'll give you an example, because I wasn't even going to talk about this, but listening to this, it just reminded me. I've been a head teacher for 8 years. I've been a head teacher of 3 different schools, and I do know what I'm doing. But before I was appointed, I went for a head teacher position at a really large primary school in Islington, and I was up against 3 other candidates over 2 days. And without trying to sound overconfident, I was clearly a long way the best candidate there. And at the end of the second day, when we talk about the argument amongst some of the people in the audience was, is it unconscious bias or is it actually conscious bias? Now, I knew for a couple of people on that panel, the selection committee, my face for whatever reason didn't fit, and they made the decision to, rather than have to appoint me because I was the best candidate, they decided not to appoint anybody. And their feedback to me was that they thought I was too young. So that is their rationale. And I've never mentioned this publicly before, but 6 months later, they appointed a white man who was younger than me. And sometimes we're too shy to talk about these things. When in reality, what we should be saying is we need models to inspire and to motivate our young teachers who are coming into the profession so they can actually see a path moving forward. And it's something that's been discussed in terms of football in this country, the number of black players in comparison to the number of black managers, that we may be seeing that these people can be seen as teachers, but why can't they then be seen as leaders? So that wasn't anything to do with what I was going to say before, but I think it's a really important point that we need leaders as role models to inspire the next generation, because we know the difference it will then make to our children.
Thank you, Kulvan. Can I pass on now to Rima? Don't forget to unmute yourself, Rima.
That might help. Okay, so just to introduce myself, it's really interesting with what Kulvan is saying. I'm a head teacher of Hollydale Primary School. Before that, I was a vice principal in Loughborough Primary School. But for me, my journey is interesting and kind of really confirms for me with what Kulvan's saying. I started off as a meal supervisor, and then I was a teaching assistant. Then I decided that whilst working in the class as a teaching assistant, that I actually had strengths that nobody had told me about. So I left that role and trained to be a teacher. Then I thought along, well, I could be a senior leader as well. So then I became a senior leader, then I became a head. And part of that journey was, why do I stop at that ceiling of being a teacher? Why can't I also be a senior leader? So although that journey was very difficult, it was one that I needed to continue that journey to be a role model. So that we have lots of teachers and teaching assistants who train to be teachers and they stop there, or they become middle leaders. And for me, part of my journey and what I do in terms of working on panels or supporting this panel here is to say, we need to keep going. We need to be working with head teachers like myself, asking us about our journey, asking us about, you know, unconscious bias, conscious bias, whatever. How did it work for us and how did we overcome that? So we need to be sharing what is happening for us. I consider myself as an inspiration, and what I say to young teachers is, yes, you can. You know, when I was going through that journey, there wasn't many people to support me. But now there are heads around like myself, Nahida, Colvern, who, if you reach out to us, we can say, we can support you. And a lot of what young teachers say is, we need coaching, we need mentoring. We need to be told that we can do this. So when they come up against the obstacles, they come up against those ceilings, they can break through. So what I can say, this is really interesting. And that data that says 95.9% of head teachers are white British, it shows you the huge amount of work that needs to be done in terms of BME leaders. So the data is improving for teachers, but there also needs to be an upward trajectory for head teachers like myself, who really have come up from the bottom. And, you know, people say I'm a single parent. I was a single parent with 4 children. I decided that I had a place in society as well. And I wanted to change the status quo for my children, which I feel that I've done. So for me, it's about giving back, and it's important for me to give back as a Black leader. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Rima. Can I hand over to Martha now, please? Don't forget to unmute.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Martha. I'm the head teacher at St Mark's Primary School in Islington, and my school is placed in one of the most deprived areas of the borough. We have huge deprivation issues and families with complex needs, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. It's a one-form-entry school. I have 9 classes in 3 phases because I have children from 2 years up. And in every phase, I have children who staff who represent the children. I have a Black or minority ethnic teacher in every single phase, and I also have support staff in all of those phases. I have middle managers who come from a BAME background, and I have a SLT made up of people from all different backgrounds. So we truly reflect the children that we serve. And it's a hard job for everyone, but it's something that we give our all to. And just because you have a successful interview, it doesn't mean you're going to be a great teacher or a successful leader in schools. And I have gone beyond just listening to what people have to say in interviews sometimes, to really trying to get to know that person, to see whether, you know, there is unconscious bias behind the great interview, to see if there is microaggression behind that great interview, to make sure that I get the right people into my school. And it's a hard job to make sure that you get the right people, but I really feel that I've got a team of people who can identify those people now. And I'm pleased to say that I've got a staffing team that I think support everyone in the very best possible way that they can. And it's been a hard job. It's a successful school. You know, it wasn't for a long time, but it is now. And it's because of the makeup of the staff, the children who are reflected by those members of staff, and us all working together. And it's a hard job, but it's definitely one that is worth doing. So, you know, speak up, ask your head teachers, you know, where are we in this school? Why aren't we being seen? Because I know that I'm going to start asking my colleagues when I'm at their schools, you know, Where are the staff that represent the children? Where are the staff that represent the community? Because for some of my colleagues, that's just not happening. And I think now is the time to speak up. So get yourselves onto governing bodies, speak up, talk to your head teachers and try and make that difference, because something needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And last but not least, can I hand over to Susan?
All right, good evening, everyone. My name's Susan Service, and as introduced, I'm the head teacher of Arts and Media School Islington, which is a secondary context. And it's interesting hearing about the characteristics of that predetermined BAME staff to be employed in the school. And my school would tick quite a few of those. It's a secondary, first of all, EAL, TA, support staff, deprivation, because I'm in the Islington Borough, just like Martha with her primary. However, it's not a school that has ineffective leadership and management, if I say so myself, and I'm a bit biased, but nonetheless, it isn't that. And I would say that my context is very much about same thing, reflecting the students that I have. I've got a very diverse context. The data that was produced, it said 17.4%. In secondary schools, generally we're non-white British. Well, mine's is 71%. Also in terms of, and that's teachers. In terms of students, it's 31%. And in my school is 84% who are non-white British. So I think there's a very good proportion of staff to students in terms of reflecting the diversity that's there. My leadership team, 50% for core leadership who are non-British. In extended leadership, actually it's the same, 50%. So it's quite interesting that whenever I'm employing staff, whether it be at leadership or not, it is very much, it has to be the best person for the job. And I've had the opposite, where I've been, you know, indirectly accused of not appointing someone because, you know, they weren't white, you know, white privilege. I was supporting the white privilege agenda. And it wasn't that. It was this person basically thought that because I was black and they were black, that they would automatically get the job. And that's not how it should be. There is an element of working hard. We all know about that. I worked really hard. But I think one of the things that I did to put me now in the percentage of female head teachers that are BAME, and there's only 3.8% of us, 96.2% of head teachers who are female are British, white British. I feel like a minority. However, when I look at the audience within this forum, majority of us are female. So there is definitely staff there who should be encouraged to get to the top and to be able to represent our communities. But you need CPD, and that's what I champion. When I was going through, I did 19 years in leadership, 11 years as an assistant, as a head of maths, and then assistant head on SLT, and then I did 8 years, 4 years as a deputy, and now I'm a head teacher for 4 years in this current school. And throughout it all, CPD has always been really important to me, and I owned it. I didn't sit and wait for somebody to say, would you like to go on this course? No, whenever it came along, like stepping into leadership, I was part of the Investing in Diversity cohort, and that gave me so much, not just knowledge, but the ability to see others who were above me, who were in strong roles and doing well, and being able to support and networking, getting to know other colleagues in different contexts. And they were experiencing things that I wasn't experiencing. But it was important because when I then met it, I knew exactly what it looked like, and it prepared me better. So CPD is extremely important. And I took a lot of time outside of school, the school day, on Saturdays, on weekends, on course to actually go and learn. And it really, I think for me, made a difference. And I think sometimes, you know, people think things are going to be handed to them on the plate. Well, it's not. And there are people there who will not give it to you. So you have to put yourself in a position where either through knowing people or through thinking about, well, what will I get out of this, which is not a bad thing, you know, What will I get from this experience? What will I get from doing this, so I can then move on to actually climb the ranks of leadership and be able to then truly make a difference, because you have the power to be able to do so. Not least the adversity that you'll face with that, but it means that you can actually make a real difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Right, we've got lots of questions coming in the chat function. We may not get through them all, but I'm going to get through as many as I can by 5:30. First question comes from, is it Sabrina? How do you support Black and minority ethnic teachers without alienating white teachers? And is this when racial literacy comes in? Is there anyone on the panel that would like to tackle that one? So how do you support Black and minority ethnic teachers without alienating white teachers? Nahida, I knew you'd want to get your head around that one.
So I think, I mean, the notion of, focus on your core purpose. What is the core purpose? It's to eliminate inequality, entrenched inequalities. And we can't do that if we don't examine institutional racism. So if it's going to offend the sensitivities of white teachers, then it means, quite frankly, those white teachers don't really grasp the meat of the problem, the kernel of the problem in schools. So it's about really it's about really communicating with clarity to schools. Thank you. Sorry, very well trained.
Don't worry, we've all been there under lockdown, Nahida.
It's really communicating the vision of the school and making sure that, I did say that we have to create safe educational spaces, and a safe educational space is one which truly challenges any form of discrimination. Why is racism any different to gender discrimination or, you know, disability discrimination? It's an uncomfortable journey. I mean, we're talking about whiteness, which has historically colonial rule and then post-colonial rule has, you know, it's been hundreds and hundreds of years. What we're disrupting is a very deep entrenched system of, you know, micro, macro, overt, covert interactions. We have to start the conversation, and there will be times when I think people will be offended, and we need to be acutely aware and sensitive to that and manage that. However, those of us who are of colour have, from the day we entered schools, experienced or entered society, feelings of rejection, discrimination, alienation, and continue to. I could, you know, write a book about micro, macro. So I don't think we need to be too concerned about, well, not that we shouldn't be too concerned, that's unfair. We need to be concerned, but we need to be honest and frank about the journey with a humanity. Everything we do must be driven with a humanity to understand, but to disrupt.
Thank you, Nahida. And I can see Kulvan, you're waving your hand as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I don't see it at all as alienation. So I agree with Nahida. And I think the easiest way to look at it is that, as a school leader, my expectations and my leadership of the team is me modelling how I want each individual teacher to lead their class. Now, equality, not every child in a class is coming in equal. So we're not going to treat everybody the same. We're going to look at equality of opportunity. And I think absolutely we should be looking at every member of staff and understand their experiences and where they're coming from and what specifically they need to enable them to succeed. And it isn't about treating someone, and people talk about positive discrimination, it's about giving people the tools to succeed. And that is going to be different for a person of a particular background in comparison to others. And I think that's a way of looking at it, which isn't about I'm treating that person differently. I'm actually talking about I'm meeting those people's needs and enabling them to be successful. And an example would be, many of the teachers that I work with will say that they have reached levels of leadership that they never thought they were capable of. And the average, I know you'll talk to a person of colour and you'll say, what are your aspirations? And the best you'll get is, oh, you know, I could be a deputy head. But why are we limiting ourselves to I could be a deputy head? It's because they're not seeing those models. And somebody has to go along and tap them on the shoulders and give them the opportunities and enable them to see how they can be successful, because the system isn't set up to enable them to see themselves as successes.
Thank you, Kulvan. Another question now from Deborah White. And this may be a question for Martin and Antonina, but it also would go to the panel, because it may be about the data, but it could also be about your experiences as head teachers. How much has performance monitoring influenced the lack of retention of Black and minority ethnic teachers, especially when they try to move into the upper pay scale? So I don't know if there's anything in the data around that, Martin or Antonina, or if that's a question for Rima or Susan or Martha to talk about. How much has performance monitoring influenced the lack of retention of Black and minority ethnic teachers, especially beyond the upper pay scale?
Well, I can just say, based on the data from the interviews, obviously there is nothing in those data sets which can give us the indication. But I did interview a few teachers who were in very successful, outstanding academies, and they felt that they had very little autonomy there, because the academic context was focused very much on math and English, whereas if you're a social studies teacher, you would probably be slightly marginalized in that context and looking to go to perhaps school outside of that context, where sociology, criminology, and subjects like that are more valued.
Okay. And Susan, Rima or Martha, any comments on that, on your experiences of that?
To be honest with you, I mean, I'm quite a pragmatic person. The performance appraisal process has objectives. If you're not teaching a core subject and you're teaching any other, it's about the outcomes of the young people. And to be fair, and we should be fair, but people are not, you should be measured against that. So if you're able to meet that, if you're able to demonstrate that you've added value to the school in terms of extracurricular and applying for threshold, you have the evidence for it, then that's absolutely fine. I mean, and I would instruct my staff and my leaders who are performance appraising to recognize that through the whole process. But then that's the organization that I'm in and I lead. And I know it may not be as fair in other places, but in some ways it should be there to support, not to actually negate against, you know, those staff actually promoting if it's obvious that they've done what they have done.
And then a related question actually about promotion. So Jason, who's a physics teacher in Bancroft School, says, how do you, the panel, support people to get promotions? Perhaps Rima or Martha?
Obviously, you know, performance is important. And as I said, I see myself, regardless of what data says, when you are in a leadership role as a BME, what you want to do is encourage others. It's important for you to do that. And I keep that as a focus, because I know that along the journey, that coaching and mentoring probably wasn't there as much. And I know if I had it, I would have progressed even quicker. We try to encourage, we give people opportunities at Hollydale to develop. That's important. What we try to do is use coaching to support those teachers. We encourage them to do courses which have other BME potential leaders on it, which I think is important, that teachers who want to aspire and have the potential, that you sometimes need that kind of support network from colleagues who have the same kind of aspiration but are not too sure. So finding courses that will support them, talking to them, and also being that role model for those teachers as well is, I think, one of the greatest things we can offer young teachers, is them seeing that it doesn't just stop at middle leadership, that you possibly can become a head teacher, you can become an Ofsted inspector. You need to go all the way. If we're going to make change as well, there's lots in the news now about Black Lives Matters, you know, institutionalized racism, which has always been there. And so, as I say, people like myself have always been marching forward to support young teachers, but using this platform even more so, if you want to call it a platform, to say, yes, we can, yes, you can achieve as well. And let us know what kind of support you need. We could assume you need X, Y, Z, but talk about what do you need to support you to aspire to the next level, which is past middle leadership.
I would like to add to
yeah,
that.
okay.
Sorry, I was just going to
No, you
say,
go first, Sue.
Thanks, Martha. The further up you get, the more important it is that you seek someone out to support you. When I went from deputy to head teacher, I remember I booked in sessions with the current head teacher then to actually sit and go through questions and answer them and be challenged on my answers and to give the answer again. And then there was another where she filmed me and I had to look at the film afterwards and see how I presented and have the stories, the scenarios that were set. And I have to say, there were times when I looked at her and her eyes were red because she was tired and she wanted to go home. But we sat there and we did that, and it was worth it because I'm now in position. So that short-term pain gave a long-term result that meant that another BAME colleague was able to climb the ranks that really can propose a glass ceiling to us. So really, if you find somebody who's willing to give you that time and you feel comfortable with them, because you're exposing yourself, and I felt exposed, but it was worth it because I was stronger when I came to the actual panel and I had to present myself.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. I mean, it's about us using our networks to support and filter down and making sure that, you know, when we know that we've got friends who have got successful people in their schools in similar positions, that we team them up with people in our schools to really give them that support and that lift into the position that they deserve.
Thank you. So next question is probably a data question, perhaps for Antonina. Were there more Black and minority head teachers in primary than in secondary schools?
I have to say that this analysis did not include senior leaders in the school because we only used publicly available data. We could only rely on percentages of teachers within schools. And due to such low numbers of minority ethnic teachers in leadership role, this data is just basically suppressed. So to get that level of data, you have to apply via ONS. And actually, that's what I think would be our next step for data analysis, to be able to trace the journeys of those people.
Thank you. A question from Taiwo. How can we make, and this relates also to another question from Khalida Begum, who's ahead of year. Taiwo's question is, how can we make sure schools are called to account over bias in terms of access to things like professional development or promotions? And Khalida also talks about, you know, is it too difficult? How do we call out institutional racism? Because people can make excuses such as, well, we just don't think you fitted in with the school, or we don't think you fitted in with the team of colleagues in which you would work. So really a question about calling it out or holding those schools to account and how we should proceed with that. Is there anyone from the panel who would like to talk to that one? Kulvan.
Well, I just think, judging by so many of the comments, first of all, there has to be a stronger focus in schools on teacher voice, in terms of what is it like to be a teacher in this institution? Not what leader thinks it's like, but actually what does it mean? What are my opportunities? And going back to the last point, we also need to stop having schools in competition with each other, because we need to be realising the responsibility we have to the profession, not just to our institution. And what you've heard from the other speakers is this capacity to give our teachers opportunities beyond our own school, to be able to go into other settings. Because the thing that comes across very strongly, and I do, you know, I've in the last few months, obviously not much has been happening recently, but in March I presented at a conference in South Gloucestershire for school leaders, head teachers, entire white audience. And previous to that, I was with you, Sarah, with prospective BAME leaders. And the difference is that there is a slight lack of confidence, because BMA leaders are not seeing the models. They do not see the same paths. They do not see the same opportunities. So what we need to do as a school, or to be held to account, is how are you ensuring that every member of staff, regardless of their background, feels that they are in an environment in which they are able to professionally develop, regardless of the subject they're teaching, regardless of the year group that they're working in, regardless of their background, and be much more inclusive in our approach, because currently there is no concept of the extent to which leaders have a ethical leadership model or an inclusive leadership model. And until that happens, you can say all the things that those people are saying. Well, I've been teaching 20 years and now we've got a teach first who's coming in to monitor me. So I think we must be much more nuanced in the way in which we are looking at leadership. And the final point, listening to the other guys, is this concept of opportunity. Now, I was bobbing along quite nicely as a deputy head, and I was told that you cannot stay as deputy head because you have to be a head teacher. And I said, well, I'm just had a third child. I don't think it's the right time. No, because you have to break that barrier to be a model for others. And I think that kind of fire to say we need to create opportunities and give chances for people to follow in those footsteps. We need to be much more forceful in our approach.
And we have time for one more, Rima, and then Nahida, and then we're done.
On mute. I totally agree, and I think what is important to say that it is hard work. You know, it's not an opportunity just given and it's like, I'm here. You do have to work hard. You do have to keep that focus. And it's not about proving yourself to anybody. It's proving it to yourself that you can do this. And I think sometimes as BME leaders, we think we've got something to prove. We panic. We're nervous because it's like, oh, there's a lot of pressure. There's no pressure. Be yourself. Do the job that you know you can do, and you know you can do it well. And I, you know, as I said, I came from being a meal supervisor, supervising children on the playground. And so if I can do it, what I say to my BME teachers or my BME network of educators is, you can do this too. You know, just believe it and go through that barrier, break through that glass ceiling that says you can be a middle leader of literacy, you're doing really well. Say, actually, no, I want to run your school when you retire. So, you know, that's the kind of drive that we want to sort of empower our young teachers with.
And final comment from Nahida.
Yeah, apologies before. I think, you know, entirely agree with Kulvan and Rima, but, you know, I think it comes back to what Kulvan says about a very fragmented system that promotes inter-school competition and doesn't see our noble profession as something that we are trying to, you know, disrupt these immoral inequalities for all children across whichever local authority you're working for. And it calls for I think, a coordinated kind of strategic response from either City Hall. I throw that to you, City Hall. Get out there and look and work it out. Actually look at the trajectories of teachers and look at local authorities and look at how well they're doing with having leaders and head teachers that truly represent those local authorities' school populations. So I think it's working at the local level in terms of networking and talking to peers and reaching out. But I think there has to be a strategic response, a political response about understanding that we will keep on reproducing the same inequality. They can pay more money to another think tank of privileged white researchers to come and tell me what I already know. But what they need to do actually is talk to people of colour who understand their communities from the inside, from the lived experience, who understand why they don't feel safe in a playground, who understand why they don't feel safe in a classroom, who understand how to enable children to truly reach their potential. What we do know about research is white teachers over decades and decades consistently have lower expectations in terms of academics and behaviour of BAME students. Why isn't that fact everywhere reported, and why aren't we doing something about it? That is holding whiteness to account. Last point.
Thank you. Very good one to end on.